Presumably, part of the reason you enrolled in the AP Psychology course was to have the opportunity to do well on the AP exam in psychology, and to earn college credit for doing so. So let's take a quick look at the breakdown of this exam, and then look more closely at the written component, the free response questions. The exam in AP Psychology is made up of two sections, both of which are timed. Section 1 is 70 minutes in length, and it includes 100 multiple choice questions, or MCQs. After a short break, students take Section 2, which is 50 minutes in length and includes 2 free response questions, or FRQs. For this exam, testing time is about 2 hours, making the AP Psychology examination one of the shortest AP exams offered by the College Board. The 100 MCQs are worth 66.7% of the test, while the FRQs are worth 33.3% of the test. In other words, Section 1 is worth twice as much as Section 2 when determining final scores. As you can imagine, MCQs overwhelmingly test concept understanding, which means that it is absolutely crucial that you complete your terms lists and ensure that you understand those most important concepts. Your grasp of the definition and application of those concepts are what determine success on the Psychology AP test. Section 2 allows you to apply your understanding. FRQ number 1 is about concept application. It assesses students' ability to explain behavior and apply theories and perspectives in authentic contexts. Each part of the question will revolve around the scenario, and this is the authentic context that you'll have to include in your response. Since 2019, and during regular administrations of the exam, FRQ number 1 is worth 7 points. Each of the 7 tasks of the question earns 1 point. FRQ number 2 is about research design. It assesses students' ability to analyze psychological research studies, including analyzing and interpreting quantitative data. Again, this question usually revolves around a given scenario. Since 2019, and during regular administrations of the exam, FRQ number 2 is also worth 7 points, with each of the 7 tasks worth 1 point. The AP Psychology FRQ is best categorized as a written response. This is not an essay. It doesn't need to include an introduction and a thesis and a conclusion. All that said, this FRQ is still a written response. Someone who, say, draws a picture illustrating their response will not earn credit. Students should always write in complete sentences and should always use appropriate grammar and syntax rules. Typical FRQ prompts look something like what you see on screen. They are multi-part questions that include numerous tasks. Since 2019, each FRQ contains 7 tasks, with each task corresponding to 1 point. However, if you look at this particular prompt from 2006 more closely, you can see that it has more than 7 tasks, and thus this one was worth more than 7 points. Let's look at this FRQ more closely so you can learn how to determine each task in a question and how to pre-write for that task. This prompt is an example of the type of question you'll see for FRQ number 2, the research design question. You can see that the prompt sets up simple parameters, as it identifies 3 specific types of research methods about which the rest of the question's tasks will revolve. If you read through the tasks for Part A, you can see that it's pretty straightforward. You need to discuss advantages of each method, that is, identify each method as you're addressing it and explain one advantage for that method. You should feel free to do pre-writing right on the prompt as you're working. So, for instance, you might jot down that an advantage of a case study is that it provides researchers an opportunity to focus on unusual cases. You might then jot down that the advantage of a correlational study is that it can provide a way to predict relationships between variables. For instance, it might reveal a positive relationship between 2 variables. And then you might jot down that an advantage of an experiment is that it can help researchers establish a cause and effect relationship between 2 variables. Now let's look at Part B. It's very similar to Part A, except now you're tasked with discussing a disadvantage to each of the 3 research methods. Let's go through the same quick pre-writing process. Well, for the case study, you might note that one disadvantage is that its results can't be generalized to a population. With a case study, you're looking at one person or one tiny group of people, so those results just can't be generalized. For the correlational study, maybe you note that a disadvantage is that these studies might be affected by a confounding variable, and so the relationship that's discovered between the two variables might not, in fact, exist. For the experiment, you might note that a disadvantage is bias. Bias might affect the process of the experiment, or it might affect the interpretation of results, and that would lead to a faulty conclusion. Finally, let's consider Part C. Unlike your responses for Parts A and B, your response for Part C has to consider the little scenario, the authentic context in College Board speak, proposed by this part of the question. So after reading that first sentence, you know that you have to consider how you, as a researcher, would use each of the 3 research methods to determine the effectiveness of the fictional vitamin J on improving memory. Note that the prompt says you don't have to describe a complete study, you just have to discuss an approach you'd use to test the effectiveness of vitamin J. So think about how you might use vitamin J in a case study. How would you test its effectiveness? Maybe you jot down that you would take notes of your subject's memory prior to taking vitamin J and then after taking it, and then you could compare the results for that one individual. With a correlational study, though, your results should indicate a relationship between vitamin J and memory, right? So your response here might be something along the lines of, I conducted a survey and the respondents reported that their memory improved when they started taking vitamin J. Of course, you know that in an experiment, you can actually try to establish cause and effect relationships. So here you might jot down that you conduct a double-blind experiment and you're going to give vitamin J to your experimental group but a placebo to your control group, and that the results will tell you whether or not vitamin J improves memory. Now that you've done your pre-writing, you're ready to write your response. Remember, you do have to write in complete sentences. They really do appreciate and require that. I can also tell you that the readers, the people who score AP tests, they also really like it when you organize your response in some way. You don't have to do this with paragraphs. You don't need an introduction or a conclusion. Simple headings work well. So when you're addressing Part A, for example, just write a little heading and then answer Part A. And then between parts, go ahead and skip a line. This is also super helpful, and it lets the scorer know when you're going on to the next part of the question. Psych FRQs are typically not long responses, nothing compared to a history LEQ or DBQ, but you do need to make sure that you address all parts of the question completely and clearly. Remember, you have 50 minutes total to complete both FRQs. The 25 minutes you have to write each question should be more than enough time for you to pre-write and write out a good response. Any lingering questions about writing these Psych FRQs? Please don't hesitate to ask your instructor.